A rhythmic pounding echoes through narrow medieval streets, not the disciplined march of soldiers or the joyful stomp of festival dancers, but something else entirely, something wrong. You round the corner into the July sun, and there she is. A woman in the town square, her body locked in violent, convulsive movement. Her feet hammer the cobblestones with such force that blood seeps through her torn shoes. Her arms flail like broken wings. But it's her eyes that freeze you in place, wide, terrified, pleading. She's not celebrating. She's trapped, and she cannot stop. Before we go deeper into this nightmare, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? It amazes me that centuries later, from every corner of the globe, we're all drawn to the same dark mysteries of our past. Her name was Frau Trophaea. The date was July 14th, 1518. The place, Strasbourg, a prosperous city in what was then the Holy Roman Empire, now modern-day France. What she triggered that morning would become one of history's most documented and most disturbing medical mysteries. Within days, dozens would join her dance. Within weeks, hundreds. And before it ended, this plague would kill not through infection or poison, but through pure, unrelenting exhaustion. The afflicted would dance until their hearts gave out, until strokes claimed them, until their bodies simply surrendered to motion they could not control. Medieval chroniclers called it the dancing plague of 1518. Modern scientists still struggle to explain it, because this wasn't just mass hysteria. It was something far stranger, a contagion of compulsion, spreading not through blood or breath, but through something invisible and terrifying. The human mind watching another human mind break. Frau Trophaea danced through that first day without stopping. Neighbors approached with water. She knocked it away while still moving, her body refusing even the brief stillness needed to drink. They offered her food. She couldn't pause long enough to swallow. As the brutal July heat intensified, her dress became soaked through with sweat, her breathing ragged and desperate. Witnesses later testified that she was clearly trying to stop. Her mouth formed words, prayers, pleas to God, cries for help, but her legs kept kicking. Her arms kept flailing. Her body had become her prison. By nightfall, something even more disturbing happened. She was still dancing. Torches were lit around the square to illuminate her continuing ordeal. Concerned citizens organized shifts, watching over her through the darkness, bringing blankets when she shivered, still dancing, and murmuring prayers as she writhed in what appeared to be a waking nightmare made flesh. Then came day 2, and that's when a man named Herr Klaus felt it begin. He described it later as an itch beneath his skin, a restlessness in his legs that sitting couldn't satisfy. Within hours, he was in the street beside Frau Trophaea, his body moving in patterns he didn't choose, a waltz with invisible partners, his arms positioned as though holding someone, spinning and stepping to music only he could hear. Unlike Trophaea's violent thrashing, his movements were almost graceful. Almost. Except for the terror in his eyes and the way he couldn't stop, even when he begged his own limbs to obey him. By the third day, 6 more had joined. By week's end, over 30 people were trapped in the dance. And here's what made it truly inexplicable. It seemed to spread through watching. Families who cared for the afflicted found themselves dancing within days. People who stood too long observing the phenomenon felt the compulsion rising in their own bodies. It was as if the very act of witnessing this breakdown of control somehow infected the observer's mind with the same terrible command: move and don't stop moving. A visiting physician named Johann Veer documented the spread with growing horror. He noted that each dancer brought their own variation. Some thrashed wildly like Trophaea, some waltzed like Klaus, some marched as though following military drums. Some performed what looked like peasant folk dances. But all shared the same core features: absolute loss of voluntary control, clear consciousness and terror throughout, and complete inability to stop even when exhaustion turned their movements into jerky, mechanical spasms. The City Council of Strasbourg faced a crisis unlike anything in their experience. After consultation with physicians, priests, and scholars, they reached a conclusion that seems breathtakingly wrong to modern eyes, but made perfect sense within medieval medical theory. The dancers, they decided, were sick because they couldn't dance properly. Their hot blood needed to be cooled through proper regulated movement, like sweating out a fever. The cure, therefore, was obvious. More dancing, better dancing, professional dancing. They hired musicians. They built a wooden stage in the largest square. They brought in professional dancers from neighboring towns to demonstrate proper technique and partner with the afflicted. They paid for the best performers in the region to come help the dancers dance it out. The result was catastrophic. The addition of live music seemed to pour gasoline on a fire. Where before the dancers had moved to their own internal rhythms, now they were driven to match the external beat. Their movements intensified, became more violent, more synchronized. The professional dancers who came to help found themselves unable to leave the stage. One by one, they were pulled into the same uncontrollable state. What was meant as treatment became recruitment. By the end of that week, over 100 people were dancing in Strasbourg's central square, and the sound, hundreds of feet pounding on wood, frantic music, occasional screams of exhaustion or pain, could be heard throughout the city, day and night. Then the deaths began. Frau Trophea was the first. On the 7th day of her ordeal, she collapsed mid-spin. Witnesses said her final movements were the most desperate yet, as though she were fighting invisible chains. Her breathing had become so labored she could barely gasp between the violent jerks of her body. When she finally fell, her limbs continued twitching for several minutes, the compulsion to dance outlasting consciousness itself. The official cause of death, exhaustion of the heart. But she was only the beginning. Medieval physician Paracelsus, who arrived during the height of the outbreak, documented the deaths in meticulous, horrifying detail. Some died of heart failure, their organs unable to sustain continuous exertion for days on end. Others suffered strokes. Some died of what he called exhaustion of the soul. Their eyes would go blank, their faces lose all expression, and they would continue moving mechanically until their bodies simply shut down like broken clockwork. The dancers couldn't eat because they couldn't hold still. They couldn't sleep because the compulsion persisted through exhaustion. They couldn't drink adequately because swallowing while in constant motion led to choking. Paracelsus wrote of feet worn down to bloody stumps, of joints dislocated from repetitive motion, of muscles that had essentially consumed themselves from the inside. Some developed what he termed dance fever, body temperatures spiking from constant exertion, causing delirium that made their movements even more violent and unpredictable. By late July, dozens were dead. Hundreds remained afflicted. The city's economy had collapsed as businesses closed and healthy citizens fled to neighboring towns. Strasbourg was running out of people capable of caring for the dancers, and no medical intervention had worked. The hot blood theory had failed. Exorcisms had failed. Bleeding, purging, prayer, all had failed. In desperation, the authorities abandoned medicine and turned to miracle. On August 3, 1518, a procession left Strasbourg that Europe had never seen before. Over 400 dancing people, some restrained in carts, others walking while still moving compulsively, accompanied by family members, physicians, priests, and the morbidly curious. They were headed to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Saverne, a saint known as the patron of dancers, but more importantly, the saint invoked to cure neurological disorders causing involuntary movement. The logistics were staggering. Dozens of wagons, scores of healthy citizens to physically restrain those whose movements were too violent, supplies for a journey with people who couldn't stop moving long enough to eat or rest properly. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of this caravan. Hundreds of people in various states of uncontrolled motion, accompanied by prayers, weeping, and the creaking of wooden wheels, audible from miles away. What happened at the shrine defies rational explanation, even by medieval standards. Multiple sworn testimonies from city officials, physicians, and witnesses described the same phenomenon. As each dancer was brought before St. Vitus's altar and blessed by the resident priests, their movements gradually slowed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but over the course of hours the frantic thrashing became less violent, then less frequent, then finally ceased altogether. Dr. Johann Weir, who had documented the plague's beginning, followed the pilgrimage to witness its end. He wrote, "Whether by divine intervention or by the mysterious workings of the human mind, I witnessed the breaking of a curse that had held these people captive for weeks. By evening, fewer than a dozen still danced. By morning, it was over." By August 5, 1518, the dancing plague had ended as mysteriously as it began. But the people who survived were not the same people who had started dancing in July. Many suffered what we would now recognize as severe trauma: nightmares, depression, an overwhelming fear of music or rhythmic sounds. Some became reclusive, terrified that certain stimuli might trigger a relapse. The physical damage was profound: joint problems, muscle deterioration, cardiovascular issues that would plague them for life. Several never walked normally again. Perhaps most disturbing were the psychological scars. Survivors described feeling like passengers in their own bodies, conscious, aware, but utterly unable to control their actions. That loss of agency, that betrayal by their own flesh, shattered their sense of self in ways that never fully healed. Strasbourg itself was traumatized. Public dancing was banned for years except during specific religious festivals. Street musicians required permits. The wooden stage built to cure the dancers was burned, and the square was ritually consecrated. The city lost nearly 15% of its adult population to death, disability, or flight. It took over a decade to recover. Word of the plague spread throughout Europe, inspiring both fear and copycat outbreaks. Over the following decades, at least a dozen other cities reported similar episodes, smaller, shorter, but following the same terrifying pattern. So, what actually happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Medieval authorities blamed demons, witchcraft, cursed bread contaminated with ergot, or planetary alignment. Modern science offers different theories, but none completely satisfying. The leading explanation is mass psychogenic illness, a collective psychological breakdown triggered by extreme social stress. Strasbourg in 1518 was suffering through famine, disease, and political instability. Most of the dancers came from the poorest neighborhoods, had recently experienced personal tragedies, and lived under unbearable pressure. The dancing may have been their mind's only available expression of desperation, a conversion of psychological anguish into physical symptom. But that doesn't fully explain the compulsive nature of the movements, the clear consciousness throughout, or why it spread so readily through observation. Some researchers suggest a neurological component, perhaps encephalitis, a viral infection affecting motor control centers. Others point to the power of social contagion, the way behaviors and psychological states can spread through populations like disease, especially under conditions of stress and uncertainty. What's most unsettling is how relevant the dancing plague remains. We live in a hyper-connected age where ideas, behaviors, and psychological states spread faster than ever before. Mass psychogenic illness still occurs. Factory workers in Cambodia who suddenly faint in waves, teenage girls in New York who develop synchronized tics, communities that share delusions through social media. We are not more rational than the people of 1518. We're just dancing to different rhythms. The dancers of Strasbourg are long dead, but their story lingers as a reminder of something we prefer to forget. Consciousness is fragile. The boundary between individual and collective experience can collapse without warning, and under the right conditions of fear and stress, entire communities can lose their grip on reality in ways that manifest as genuine physical suffering. Frau Trophea stepped into that street on a July morning and began to dance, because something, psychological trauma, neurological illness, social contagion, or forces we still don't understand, compelled her body to move. Her individual crisis became a collective nightmare because human beings are fundamentally connected in ways that bypass reason and will. The hundreds who joined her weren't weak. They were ordinary people living through extraordinary pressure, and they fell victim to one of humanity's most basic features, our tendency to mirror those around us, especially in moments of crisis. The plague ended at St. Vitus's shrine, but the conditions that created it never went away. In different forms, with different rhythms, viral challenges, conspiracy theories, mass panic, political extremism, the dance continues. We are all potential dancers, waiting for the right combination of stress, suggestion, and social pressure to find ourselves moving to compulsions we cannot name or control. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is what we still don't know. 500 years later, with all our scientific sophistication, we cannot say with certainty why it started or why it stopped. There are aspects of our collective psychology that remain fundamentally mysterious. Forces that can compel us to behave in ways that defy explanation. Contagions of the mind that spread faster than any virus and prove just as deadly. Somewhere, in some stressed community facing unbearable pressure, the next dance may already be beginning. And when it does, will we recognize it before our own feet start moving? Before we look down and realize we cannot stop? The music is always playing, just beneath the surface. The question is only whether we can hear it before we start to dance.